and welcome to Once Upon a Storybook with Cynthia. My name is Cynthia from Joyful's Creations, and I am excited to be here today and share another angel story with you from the book In the Arms of Angels. Today's story is titled Angels on the Battlefield. Benjamin Franklin once said, "God governs in the affairs of men, and if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, it is probable that an empire can rise without his aid." It is logical to assume that angels have been at the scene of every war in history, including the very first, their own battle in heaven. Lucifer was defeated there, but can anyone doubt that evil is still among us? Certainly, if any group is worthy of protection and encouragement, it is military personnel who willingly lay down their lives to defend others. Angelic happenings are widely reported from those on the battlefields. The angels of Mons in World War I, for example, was a female figure in a flowing white gown who led an entire English regiment to safety, then disappeared before their bewildered eyes. A World War II fighter pilot, blinded and flying a damaged plane, was guided to a safe landing by a voice he never identified. Angels do not always rescue those involved in war, but we can be sure that our loved ones are never alone. It was November 27, 1950, and Sergeant Alfred Green of Bath, Maine, and his regiment were valiantly battling the North Koreans at the Chosin Reservoir. Alfred had spent more than 18 months fighting in World War II and had decided to make a career for himself in the U.S. Army, but nothing had prepared him for this ongoing battle. The conditions were brutal. Temperatures were 35 degrees below Fahrenheit, soldiers were suffering from frostbite, and they had outdated equipment and dwindling rations. The soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division were told to go east up the side of the mountain behind them to replace a Marines division that was moving west. Wearily, they started a trek. There was only one road, Alfred recalls, and about an hour into the trip, it began to snow. The farther up we climbed, the closer we got to the Manchurian border. The men reached the top at about 4 in the afternoon, but it was impossible to dig in because of the frozen ground. The soldiers in Alfred's gun section prepared their howitzers in firing position as best they could. The cold, exhausted soldiers did not know that China had just entered the conflict. Unfortunately, they were moving directly into harm's way. The North Koreans were behind them, and the Chinese were waiting just ahead. Around 4 in the morning, Alfred and the others were jolted awake by gunfire and bugles. Battery A was to the right of us, just below, and they were being attacked by the Chinese, Alfred recalls. Alfred awakened the 7 men under his command. They and the others in Battery B joined the fray. At daybreak, we discovered that we were completely surrounded. We were losing men at a record pace. It was the most terrible situation Alfred had ever encountered. The fighting continued for 2 days as the men fought off the Chinese invasion. But casualties were high. Late on the second day of the battle, High Command saw the hopelessness of the circumstances and ordered the soldiers to withdraw from the reservoir area. 26 trucks lined up, all carrying the wounded, but as they broke through roadblocks, the Chinese followed. They were shooting and jumping onto the trucks, grabbing guns and clothes. How were the remaining foot soldiers going to get out of here? He considered the options. There was a mountain wall on one side of the road which offered no way of escape. High railroad tracks bordered the other side. Beyond those tracks were rice paddies, and the Marines company that the infantry regiment had replaced was somewhere beyond the paddies. But how could they climb up and over those tracks without putting themselves directly in the firing line of the Chinese? They seemed blocked at every turn. It was now about 10 p.m., and Alfred had come to the conclusion that he would soon die. He had already been shot twice in the legs and once in the back. He couldn't remember when he had last eaten or drunk, and the unrelenting cold was unbelievable. Far worse than physical suffering, however, were the sights and sounds of war. He would never forget the moans, the weeping, the blood-stained snow wherever he looked. Slowly now, aware that he was probably in shock, Alfred climbed into the back of the truck and collapsed next to a wounded soldier. I began to pray my last, he says. My Catholic background had taught me how to pray, and I asked God to please help me and the others. When he had finished, he got out of the truck and resumed guard duty. What should they do? It was then that out of the darkness, Alfred noticed a very unusual man walking toward him. The first odd thing was that he wasn't dressed for the cold. He wasn't wearing a uniform or even a hat or a jacket. The stranger was young, clean, and unruffled. An unexpected burst of normalcy in this horrific setting. It was almost as if we were out for a serene Sunday stroll. Before Alfred could ask any questions, the stranger approached him. You can take your men under those tracks, he told Alfred, as if he knew what Alfred had been thinking. I've lost my men, and there are many of us who are wounded, Alfred protested. The young man looked around at the dazed, disheveled soldiers. There's a culvert down there beyond the rice paddies. You can't see it from here, he insisted. Take them under the tracks, and you'll be safe. Albert was bewildered. There was no culvert. He and many others had been in this area several times, and they would have known about it. Why would this stranger say such a thing? And yet there was obviously something different, even otherworldly, about him. A lump rose in Alfred's throat. The man put his hand on Alfred's shoulder and looked deeply into his eyes. Go, he said gently. God bless you. God? Hadn't Albert just asked God for help? Alfred blinked. The young man had vanished as quickly as he arrived. Spread the word, Alfred told the soldier nearest him. We're going under the tracks. It was approaching midnight when the survivors ran for their lives under the railroad tracks. Yes, there was the culvert, in a place where no culvert had been, just as the stranger had promised. Amazed, Alfred and the others scrambled through. Their journey was a nightmare. They were ill, some were wounded, wet and frozen. They didn't have a compass or any specific directions. As dawn broke, the entire group reached safety at the Marines' camp. Had it been another few hours, Alfred realized, most of them would have succumbed. How did you get through? The astonished commander asked. Alfred had no answer. Who discussed angels in the midst of hell? 4 months later, Alfred was released from a Tokyo hospital and attended a ceremony where he was awarded the Silver Star for action against armed enemy, 2 Purple Hearts, and a commendation from the Korean government. I'm accepting these awards for my men, he told the assembly. They were the brave ones. He gave 24 years to his country, found a beloved wife, and today enjoys his 4 children and 15 grandchildren. But he's never forgotten the prayer he said at a desperate moment, or the answer that came. After several years in the quagmire that became the Vietnam War, the situation had started to change. Although the South Vietnamese and American troops had fought valiantly to protect the people from the violence of the communists, Viet Cong guerrilla fighters, as April 1975 approached, it was obvious that they were losing the war. American consulates in several cities had already been evacuated. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops were now approaching Saigon, the capital city of South Vietnam. It appeared that they would settle for nothing less than the unconditional surrender and would kill as many military and civilians as was necessary to achieve this goal. During these years, Lich Lee's husband, Duke, had worked for the U.S. Department of Defense as a technician, and part of his job included repairing equipment. Duke earned an American salary, which, by Vietnamese standards, was a considerable amount of money. The Lee family had lived for several years in Da Nang. In a huge house, they employed a maid for Lich, and they owned a television, a car, and a refrigerator. When the United States began to pull out of Vietnam, Duke lost his job. His family, which now included 2 young sons and a baby daughter, had moved to Saigon so that Duke could find work. Saigon was a thriving city, much like those in America or Europe. The family moved into an apartment near the air base. Duke worked for a Korean firm and traveled extensively. Lich had always been apprehensive about the war, but as had others, she learned to accept it and go on with her everyday life, which was a busy one given that she had 3 preschoolers. But recently the fighting had gotten closer, and those whose lives had been intertwined with the American presence knew that they must leave at all cost. On April 23rd, Duke went on a business trip to Iran, but not before arranging for his family to leave Saigon and go to Korea. He had the paperwork processed and purchased tickets on a boat bound for Korea. They would surely be safe. But it was not to be. During the next few days, word spread throughout Saigon that the American embassy was processing exit visas for its citizens. If the Americans were leaving, what would happen to the South Vietnamese people? Throngs of people attempted to obtain visas of their own from the embassy, and others bribed Vietnamese officials. Marines were posted at the entrances to the consulate to keep people without papers away from the building. A mood of panic and a sense of fear about being left behind developed during the last week, says one observer. It was a nightmare, with desperate South Vietnamese looking for ways to escape and authorities trying to break up the lines. Each day brought more dire news. On April 28, Litch heard the rumble of gunfire. She and the children had remained in the apartment, unsure of their next move. But there was only one chance for them now. They must leave their home and work their way through the crowds to an official, a plane, a boat, to some way out. Litch stayed up all night, and at 4 a.m., fighting down panic, she hid money, some jewelry, and the family heirlooms on herself and dressed the children. "Where are we going, Mommy?" her oldest son asked, rubbing his eyes. "To safety," Litch assured him. In her heart, she was not so sure. When she reached downtown Saigon, despite the early hour, she recalls that it was a mob scene. People crowded the streets, trying to force their way through the locked American embassy gates. The city was being bombed, and she watched helplessly as American helicopters and buses began evacuations. Did Duke know what was happening? How would they find each other? She looked at her children, trusting in innocent faces. What would become of them? All that day, Litch wandered the streets carrying her baby and attempting to find help or transportation, and trying to protect her sons from stampedes that would break out without warning. Artillery rounds and rockets hit a nearby airbase just a few miles away. Reports circulated of advancing enemy divisions. Time was running out. That evening, Litch found a space on the teeming street and laid her exhausted children on it. They cried out for food, but Litch had nothing to give them. She would stay awake to keep frantic people from trampling over them. What would she do tomorrow? Litch had been raised in a Buddhist culture and sometimes prayed to her ancestors, but now she felt an inner stir, almost indefinable. She wanted, no, she needed to pray, but to someone far more powerful than people. But how did one do that? The next thing Litch experienced was a swift tug on her clothes. Abruptly, she opened her eyes. It was still dark, and she had fallen asleep on the street. The children were sleeping and safe. A Vietnamese man had been tugging on her clothes, bending over her. "I have a taxi," he told her. "Do you want a ride?" Litch blinked, but the man was still there. A ride? After an entire day of searching for transportation, a cab driver comes to her? Out of all these desperate people? But Litch asked no questions. With the sound of rockets even closer, she and the man picked up the children and put them in the cab. Soon the cab pulled up near the harbor, where a ship stood anchored. It was not an American vessel, but at this point Litch knew only that it represented freedom. If she could get on. This area seemed as crowded as the streets she had just left. "Good luck," the cab driver waved and turned away. "Good luck to you, and thank you," she bid him as he disappeared into the deep shadows. She would think about his miraculous appearance later. The boat, Litch now realized, was for military personnel. To keep civilians from boarding, bars with spikes and barbs had been laid all over the beach. Few people were attempting to cross the hazardous barrier, but Litch plunged forward. As she ran, carrying her baby daughter and dragging the boys alongside, their feet were cut and the boys began to cry. Then, without warning, the boat left the shore. Litch watched in shock as it sailed away. In despair, she broke down in tears. The sounds of explosions were closer, the people screaming in terror. There was no place left to run. Would she and the children die here? Would Duke ever know what happened to them? But at the other end of the waterfront, Litch saw a second boat, still docked. People were fighting one another to board, but somehow she got through the crowd and approached the actual ramp. Litch looked at it, and her heart sank. It was a thin gangplank, with no railings, swaying in the wind, attached high above the water. She couldn't get across. She had been terrified of heights all her life. She wouldn't be able to balance herself while carrying 3 children. Frantically, Litch looked around and spotted a man standing in the shadows. "Sir, who can board this boat?" she asked. "Anyone, if you can get on," he replied. Impulsively, she pulled money out of her garments and approached him. "Will you get my sons on the boat, sir?" she asked. "If I don't survive, at least they will have a chance." He met her eyes. "I will," he answered, and he took hold of each boy. Litch looked at them, her heart breaking. Would she ever see them again? Would this man take the money, abandon her sons to the approaching gunfire, and simply leave? It was their only chance. Again, Litch felt that inner tug. "God, keep them safe," she whispered in her heart. God. She had heard about him. Was this a prayer? She knew no other. As the man and her sons disappeared into the night, she returned to the swaying gangplank, which was empty for the moment. Clutching little Anai, her daughter, tightly, Litch closed her eyes. "Help me across, God." Then, her feet torn and bleeding, she stepped down onto the thin strip. It swung, and she almost lost her balance. She would not look. She could not. But she was still upright. Slowly she did. Slowly she slid, one foot out, then another. Her eyes were still tightly shut. She continued on, and suddenly her feet touched something solid, and people on the boat reached out to pull them both to safety. Litch opened her tear-filled eyes. There in front of her stood her sons. How had the stranger boarded the boat with them when she climbed aboard the only possible way? She would never know, and she never saw the man again. As the day dawned, Saigon was totally cut off from the rest of South Vietnam. Explosions blasted the city and caused an immediate halt to evacuations. Eventually, evacuations resumed, and the war officially ended as communist tanks rolled down the streets and the last American Marines left Saigon on helicopters. But by that time, the Lee family was sailing towards Singapore, the first of many stops on the way to America. It would be a year before Duke found his family, and many years before the Lees felt completely at home in Texas, their adopted land. But Litch will never forget the moment when she discovered God and his angels in disguise. All it took was a prayer. Sergeant Steve Manchester, a U.S. Army military police officer, was there when the Americans crossed from Saudi Arabia into Iraq in Operation Desert Storm. It was hell on earth. It took 4 days before the ground war ended, and history was made. But for Steve, the war was far from over. As did most soldiers, he had more time to serve. 2 weeks after the last shots were fired, Steve was on guard duty at a barren traffic control point in Iraq. It looked like all the other checkpoints in the region, improvised gravel roads cut in and out amid the sand that was everywhere. The soldiers found their way around mainly by odometer readings and an occasional map. Steve was bored, and he missed his wife. They'd been married only a short time, and the heavy gold wedding ring still felt strange on his finger. A lone vehicle approached. It was an American vehicle, so he waved it through. The driver was a medic whose name tag read Matthews. He looked confused, but he was wearing a wide grin. "Man, am I glad to see you," he said to Steve. "I lost my convoy in the dust storm that just passed through. I'm supposed to be on a main supply route green." Steve chuckled. The entire area was his patrol, and he could have driven the Iraqi roads blindfolded. He gave the relieved Matthews directions, watched the vehicle pull away, and turned to the tedium of the desert. Several trying months passed. The duty was difficult, especially collecting prisoners and trying to save children who accidentally tripped landmines, all in temperatures that were above 100 degrees. Enormous dung beetles, snakes, scorpions, and other insects slithered into sleeping bags at night, guaranteeing few hours of real rest. Steve thought that the sand was worse. It was as fine as powdered sugar. It stuck to sweating bodies like tar to shoe soles. And it was there when they brushed their teeth, showered, and even ate. One afternoon, as coalition forces began moving south, Steve's platoon sergeant, Tony Rossini, approached. "Hey, kid, how about giving me a ride into Saudi?" Tony asked. "My knees began acting up and I need painkillers. I can use the time away, and from the look of it, so could you." Without waiting for an answer, Tony slid into the passenger side of his vehicle. Steve followed, anything to break the monotony. The men made good time joking and laughing along the dusty road. As he drove, Steve kept an eye on the vast terrain to make sure they were not being followed. There were still Republican guard out on the loose, soldiers who came out of hiding during the dark hours, but they saw no one, and soon they were only an hour from safety in Saudi Arabia. Just then, however, the blue sky turned into a blinding orange, and winds swept up the sand, a sandstorm. It rolled in like a wave, picking up tons of sand and carrying it along, Steve says. Our procedure was to take cover and wait it out. He slowed, squinting to see the trail. A sharp bang popped from the vehicle's right side. In super slow motion, the Humvee tipped left toward the driver outside. The Humvee tipped left toward the driver's side. The windshield cracked at the top, then spidered through the center. The desert seemed to spin end over end. A heavy field phone smashed into the back of Steve's skull, and he went limp. I felt as if I were being submerged into a pool of warm water. The sensation was heavenly, unlike any peace I'd ever experienced. I watched as my life played out before me like a slideshow, with one vivid picture after another brought into the light. I was euphoric. Then Steve thought of his wife. They had barely begun their life together, and he had a future waiting. No, he wouldn't die yet, especially not in the desert. The struggle was brief, and soon he opened his eyes and through a maze of pain looked first at his left hand. His wedding ring was gone. How strange. He was lying on sand, and he realized, and he had obviously been thrown from the vehicle. Painfully, he turned and saw the Humvee, almost 40 feet away, lying upside down. Its engine was still running and leaking fuel oil. Slowly, Steve stood and took a few tentative steps. Then he saw Tony. Tony was hanging upside down within the wreckage, suspended in midair by his seatbelt, and he appeared to be unconscious. The vehicle could blow up. Ignoring his injuries, Steve stumbled to the Jeep. "Tony, get out!" he yelled. No response. The engine raced faster and the gasoline dribbled across the sand. Instinctively, Steve unbuckled the safety belt, caught Tony, and dragged him out. Laying him on the sand a safe distance away, Steve took Tony's pulse. It was faint, but it was there. Tony began to babble. Steve was in shock, but as the Army had trained him, he treated Tony's symptoms. Loosen clothing, elevate feet, moisten victim's lips, shield him from the sun. "Don't worry, Tony. I'll get us out of this one," Steve murmured. "We'll be okay." The empty words drifted off into the desert. Tony mumbled, shivering in the heat. What were they going to do? Steve removed his shirt and covered Tony's upper body with it. He then struggled back to the smashed Humvee. He realized that because the sand had blinded him, he had hit a boulder, which flipped the Humvee several times and completely crushed the driver's side. That door was lying 20 feet away. Steve's spine tingled. Had he been wearing his safety belt? He would have been crushed by the weight of the vehicle's roof. Instead, he had bounced easily around, finally thrown safely aside. He had been blessed. But now what? Tony was seriously injured, so traveling on foot was impossible. They were in the middle of nowhere with the sandstorm still blowing. They had no food and only enough bottled water for a few hours. Although Steve got on the radio and tried again and again, no one answered his pleas for help. Nobody knew we existed. The guys at base camp didn't expect us back till evening, so there wouldn't be a search started until tomorrow. Fighting off despair, Steve grabbed his rifle, a box of ammunition, and a ragged blanket. Once again he looked around in the sand for his wedding ring, a symbol of all his hope. But it was a pointless search. Tony had just opened his eyes when Steve returned. "What the hell happened?" he murmured. Steve explained the accident, adding an apology. Tony raised his hands to the sky. "You worry too much, Stevie boy. Just get us out of here." "No sweat." Steve looked into his boss's frightened eyes and lied. "I radioed for help. The guys should be here in no time." Tony grinned weakly and closed his eyes again. Steve bent his head and prayed. 2 hours passed. Tony was in and out of consciousness. Steve was in both physical and emotional pain. He feared Tony's death even more than his own. Since he had caused the accident for the first time during the war, he wept. Suddenly the desert atmosphere changed. Was that a sound? A call? Steve's head snapped up and his eyes narrowed against the still blowing sand. Something was approaching. Was it the enemy? No. "Hey!" he yelled at an American Humvee, a lone soldier at the wheel. Steve could hardly believe it. Was he dreaming? "Don't go away." It was no illusion. The Humvee pulled alongside Steve and the soldier got out and leaned over to put his hand on Steve's shoulder. "Lay down, Sarge. I'm going to take care of you now. We'll get you out of here." With that he winked. Steve was stunned. He remembered that grin. It was Matthews, the medic he directed a few months ago. "How?" Steve started. "Nice to see you again, too," Matthews answered cheerfully. "I've been assigned the scout vehicle. I'm about 10 minutes ahead of our convoy. They should be along real quick." "How did you know we were here?" Steve persisted, still astonished at Matthews' timely arrival. "Did my radio transmission get through?" "What transmission?" "We were just passing through here on our way back." "Back to where?" Steve was going to ask, but instead he collapsed gratefully on the sand. It was time to give responsibility to the medic beside him, however miraculous his arrival. Slipping in and out of awareness, Steve sensed the soldier working on Tony and then turned to him. Matthews quietly strapped Steve to a long board, cut his pants and shoulder holster, splinted his arm, and administered an IV, all with gentle, capable hands. Steve was safe. More important, Tony was safe. Steve could hear the medevac helicopter approaching in the distance. It was a miracle. And yet Steve realized that the convoy Sergeant Matthews was supposedly leading had never arrived. And who had alerted the chopper? He might never know. But prayers did get answered, and now the helicopter was whipping the sand as it landed. 4 GIs alighted and ran toward them, lifting Tony's canvas litter. They carried him to the chopper, loaded him in, and returned for Steve. "Thank you," Steve yelled to Matthews as the men lifted him. But the high-pitched whir of the chopper was too loud. There was no way Matthews could have heard him. With another of those amazing grins, the sergeant ran to the helicopter, ducked under the spinning blades, and leaned inside. Grabbing Steve's hand, he pushed something into Steve's palm. Then, with a thumbs up, he turned away. Steve opened his hand, and there was his gold wedding band, slightly dented but shining brightly, the promise of new life. How? But the time for questions was over. The time for rest and healing had begun. "Thank you, Matthews. Thank you, God." Steve slid the ring onto his finger and laid back as the chopper took to the air. War. It is with us always in some corner of the world, but we can recognize hope too whenever it appears. On March 19, 2003, the deadline for the Iraq War looming, Jews in Jerusalem celebrated Purim, God's great deliverance of his people, as recorded in the book of Esther. At one point during the feast, a majestic rainbow appeared. Observers report there had been some rain, but at this point the sun was shining brightly, not the usual conditions for a rainbow. But the rainbow grew brighter. As its right end came down into the Judean desert and its left near the Mount of Olives, as we watched, an onlooker pointed out, the colors changed and the rainbow moved and extended to where the ancient city of David rises to connect with the mountain of Moriah, the Temple Mount. The rainbow reportedly stayed in place for about 30 minutes, and a fainter one emerged above the first arc. At the same time, Lent was beginning, and the Presbyterian chaplain, Major Barb Scherer, was looking for ashes to distribute to the Protestant soldiers in Camp Budera in Iraq. Traditionally, we burn palms the previous Palm Sunday and use those ashes the following year as a sign of penance, Barb says, but of course, there were no ashes in the desert. Not from palms, but there had been a fire the previous week in the central dining facility, which spread to 5 tents. Amazingly, everyone had escaped, and what could have been a tragedy was regarded by most as a miracle. What better ashes to use, Barb thought, than those left from this fire? The site was under guard, so Barb brought a cup and explained her request to the officer in charge. Taking her cup, he sent a soldier to the rubble to scoop up some ash. This enough, he asked, returning the cup to her. Perfect, Barb answered. She put the cup in a plastic bag and went back to her tent. Some of the particles were lumpy, she noticed, so she decided to crunch the ash into smaller fragments. As she dug, her plastic knife hit something metallic. Barb pulled it out. It was a flat metal cross that was smudged from the fire. It bore the memorable words, "Jesus is Lord." Angels, rainbows, new life from ashes, they are all signs to the hungry heart. The message to me is clear, Barb says. God walks with us through the terrible firestorms of our lives, and we are lifted unharmed out of the ashes. Well, this one was not such a short story, but it still was a great couple of stories. And I am so glad that you joined me today for Once Upon a Storybook and this wonderful story about angels, and just that God does indeed walk through life with us, and he takes care of us and he provides for us. Well, thank you for joining me, and I cannot wait to come back next week and read yet another one of these wonderful true angel stories. Until then, have a great week and be joyful. Bye, everyone.